Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into one of the greatest and most macabre tragedies in English royal history. The agonizing death of Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII. Set aside the glittering tales of the Tudor court, because tonight's story smells of something else. The odor of decay and despair. Edward VI, the one born to secure the future of an entire dynasty, ultimately lay on his deathbed, with his body rotting from the inside out at the age of 15. His lungs gradually liquefied, his skin cracked open, and the stench of death spread through Greenwich Palace, and upon his swollen hands he was forced to sign treacherous political documents. As the young king was dying, political forces scrambled over his decaying corpse, turning Edward into a manipulated pawn. Edward's story did not end with a peaceful passing. It ended with a body hurriedly sealed in layer upon layer of lead and wood, meant to bury the horrifying truth about a monarch's final ordeal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Don't forget to let me know where you're watching from and what the local time is. I'm always curious about our global community. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The scent of decay had permeated the air long before the youthful monarch drew his final breath. In the summer of 1553, within the shadowed halls of Greenwich Palace, all who entered Edward VI's chambers found themselves instinctively covering their faces against the overwhelming stench. Where once stood England's brightest hope, now lingered a foul odour that clung to every tapestry and marble sill. The young king, only 15 years of age, was literally rotting from within, even as he struggled to cling to life. His very existence had been secured at great cost. Henry VIII had severed ties with Rome and seen two of his queens lose their heads in the desperate pursuit of a male heir. When Edward was born on the 12th of October, 1537, London erupted in celebration, bonfires blazing into the night, church bells ringing unceasingly, and the sovereign himself weeping tears of relief, convinced that the Tudor line was finally unassailable. Yet from the first moment he uttered a cry. Edward bore within him the seeds of his own undoing. An inherent flaw that would betray not only the boy but the entire Tudor dream of seamless succession. His body, fundamentally compromised at birth, became a vessel for relentless suffering. The physicians who remained at his bedside in those final days later confessed that the sights they witnessed would haunt their dreams until their own deaths. Dr. John Caius, among the foremost medical authorities of his era, meticulously recorded the grotesque ulcers that perforated the king's skin, forming ragged wounds from which foul-smelling discharge oozed continuously. Each breath from Edward's lungs, ravaged by what modern science recognizes as tuberculosis, expelled fragments of decaying tissue steeped in blood, a crimson mist that stained the sheets and echoed the kingdom's mounting dread. His legs swelled to nearly twice their normal girth, the skin stretching taut until it split in several places, revealing festering flesh beneath. The flesh, soft as damp leather and slick with putrid moisture, shone in the dim candlelight like something extraordinary and terrible. Those who cared for him would later recall how, even as the young king's hair fell away in clumps and his fingernails blackened before detaching from their beds, the machinery of state demanded that the performance continue. Courtiers in whispered urgency spread false reports of his improvement. Emissaries bearing urgent letters of condolence and concern were turned away at the palace gates. Any official who dared murmur a word of the prince's true condition risked imprisonment or worse. Despite every visible sign of collapse, royal proclamations insisted on his steady recovery. The Tudor realm had become a theatre of denial, and its unwilling star was a child whose body was dissolving in real time. Every announcement from the throne extolled his improving health. Every missive from trusted courtiers insisted that the swelling would soon subside and that he would once more walk freely among his people. Yet outside the gilded apartments, behind locked doors and silenced lips, servants laboured ceaselessly to change bedding that had become soaked through with blood and secretions. They told of nights spent stoking fires beneath iron cauldrons of vinegar to attempt in vain to mask the stench. They spoke of waking to the sound of Edward's raspy cough, echoing down the corridors, a dry, rattling percussion that spoke of a body falling apart from the inside. All knew the grim truth that no official record could contain. The boy king lay dying, his flesh betraying him as surely as any traitor. But the Tudor court, gripped by obsessive concern for appearance and legacy, could not acknowledge the depth of his decline. Instead, they wove a web of half-truths and denials, guarding the gruesome reality as fervently as they guarded the very throne he would one day hold. In that summer of 1553, the air of Greenwich Palace carried more than the whisper of palace intrigue. It carried the hollow promise that a dynasty built on power and ceremony could somehow withstand the unstoppable force of death itself. And so the stench lingered, a silent testament to the fragility beneath Tudor grandeur, as Edward VI, England's ill-fated hope, faded away in the candlelit gloom. The post-mortem examination of Edward VI revealed a catalogue of medical horrors that even seasoned Tudor physicians found shocking. In the days that followed his passing, the embalmers laid bare the young king's internal organs, each in a different stage of decay. The liver, normally a deep russet brown, had turned a sickly yellow-green and crumbled at the slightest touch, as though it were nothing more than brittle parchment. The heart, that proud symbol of courage and regal strength, lay swollen to an unnatural size, its surface marred by numerous lesions, ulcer-like wounds that marred the delicate tissue. Yet most disturbing of all were the remains of his lungs, where once robust organs had worked tirelessly to draw breath. Now gaping cavities yawned, pockets once filled with life's vital air, replaced by foul, putrid fluid. As the chest cavity was opened, that fluid spurted forth, its stench so overpowering that some of the embalmers had to stagger back in revulsion. Contemporary descriptions of the scene were carefully concealed in private letters and coded diplomatic dispatches, but when Sir John Hayward at last felt secure enough to speak freely many years later, he painted an even grimmer picture. He wrote of how the boy king's skin, once fair and unblemished, had taken on a greenish hue in his final weeks, mirroring the decay beneath. He recalled the odour that clung to every breath, a reek of rotting meat, more suited to a cesspit than a palace chamber. The servants, Hayward noted, were reduced to changing Edward's bedding multiple times each day, for the mixture of blood, pus, and sputum leaked through sheet after sheet in an endless, shameful procession. In life, Edward had been lauded for his sharp mind and precocious grasp of languages. In those final, twilight hours, he was reduced to what amounted almost to a conscious corpse. The boy who once discoursed on theology and statecraft now lay motionless, save for the occasional tremor or gasp, his spirit trapped in a body betraying him from within. This physical decline did not occur in isolation. It became the backdrop to a ghastly political ballet. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, wielded power in Edward's name as Lord President of the Council, fully aware that the prince's demise would elevate his half-sister Mary, an ardent Catholic, to the throne. In desperation, Northumberland orchestrated the infamous device for the succession, a clandestine manoeuvre to bypass Mary and install Lady Jane Grey as queen. Behind closed doors, he rallied a handful of nobles, prepared proclamations, and marshalled troops, all while Edward lay dying in agony. The very hands that once held noble quills to sign proclamations of peace were now grotesquely swollen with edema, turning his fingers into clubbed, uncooperative stumps. Yet Northumberland insisted the king sign the new succession documents, guiding the boy's swollen hand where his own signature had once flowed with regal confidence. Caught between relentless suffering and the demands of state, Edward became a pawn in a deadly struggle for power. Each inflicted signature further drained the life from his frail form. Each urgent visitor risked breathing in the miasma of his chamber. Servants whispered of nights spent burning aromatic herbs in vain attempts to disinfect the room, but their efforts were futile against the tide of corruption within the flesh. Meanwhile, courtiers who dared question the scheme or exhibit sympathy faced the spectre of imprisonment, or worse, a fate that kept many silent even as their hearts ached. Thus, as the summer of 1553 wore on, Edward remained confined to his bed, his breath growing shallower by the hour. The royal physicians, some compelled by duty, others by fear, applied every treatment known to Tudor medicine. Leeches drained him of blood. Blistering plasters scorched his chest in a cruel effort to draw out evil humours. And potions of mercury and arsenic were administered in the hope of some miraculous cure. Each remedy, though well-intentioned by the standards of the age, inflicted new wounds and further weakened his weakened constitution. All the while, the court's focus shifted from compassion to calculation. Northumberland's agents ensured that no official record admitted Edward's true condition. Public addresses continued to trumpet his steadfast recovery. Yet behind heavy tapestries, the chamber doors were bolted, and only those sworn to secrecy dared enter. The sight of the once vibrant child, now mere husk and hollow gaze, was a sight too dreadful for idle spectators. It was as though the very life force of Tudor England was draining away, leaving only facades and whisperings in its wake. In the hush that descended each evening, the palace corridors echoed with the soft creak of the bed and the muffled, rasping breath of England's ill-fated monarch. And beyond those walls, across the kingdom, the people remained unaware that their prince was dying not with the dignity of a king, but in a chamber saturated with the stink of decay, a tragic testament to the fragility of power and the horrors to which ambition could drive men. The true extent of Edward's suffering was deliberately concealed within the polished annals of the Tudor court. Yet private testimonies paint a portrait of physical deterioration almost beyond comprehension. Witnesses later recalled how his once Tudor red hair, lustrous and bright like his father's, fell away in clumps, leaving behind a scalp marred by festering ulcers. Each sore oozed a foul fluid, crusting over in grotesque patterns that servants feared to touch. His teeth, loosened by malnutrition and persistent infection, began loosening in their sockets, one by one slipping free and falling, rendering him incapable of eating anything but thin gruels and broth. The boy who had once delivered speeches in flawless Latin and elegant Greek could by those final weeks scarcely whisper a word. His voice was shredded by relentless coughing fits and the repeated agony of vomiting blood and bile. Yet Edward's story began with such promise. On the morning of the 12th of October 1537, the corridors of Hampton Court Palace buzzed with anticipation. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, had endured over 30 hours of harrowing labour, summoned from her strength to bring forth the long-awaited male heir. When the prince finally arrived, he appeared vigorous and hale, his cheeks plump, his limbs thrumming with life. He bore the distinctive tuft of red hair that marked him as Tudor royalty, and his tiny features, framed by lace collars and silk wraps, echoed his father's strong countenance. Henry's joy knew no bounds. 3 days later, he created his newborn son, Prince of Wales, a title once held by his own forebears, and commanded that celebrations across the kingdom rival the very splendour of his own coronation. In London's public squares, fountains were turned to wine, coursing in burgundy torrents that sparkled under the autumn Sunday. Merchants handed out cups of sweet-spiced mead, while the pounding of drums and the triumphant notes of trumpets filled the streets. Every cathedral and parish church in England raised its bells in unison, their peals a chorus of thanksgiving that seemed to echo up to heaven itself. Court poets dubbed the new prince "He who shall repair the ruins of Troy," a grand metaphor to match the scale of the festivities, and to proclaim that the Tudor line, long beset by turmoil, would at last stand unbroken. Nevertheless, even amid these heady triumphs, shadows gathered. Jane Seymour, who had given everything in that cruel labour, never recovered her strength. Within just 12 days of Edward's birth, she succumbed to puerperal fever, the dreaded postpartum infection that claimed so many motherhoods in that era. Her passing plunged the court into mourning, and left Henry stricken, his exuberant joy now laced with profound grief. Whispers among courtiers suggested a chilling omen, that a child born amid such suffering might be marked by fate for a life of pain and an early grave. Yet Henry, ever the resolute monarch, refused to see such signs as anything but trials to overcome. He insisted on an elaborate christening, determined that no expense or ceremony be spared in safeguarding his precious heir. The ceremony, held at St. Paul's Cathedral, was the most magnificent England had ever seen. The prince, robed in the finest silk embroidered with golden Tudor roses, was carried down the nave by 8 noblemen, each bearing a silver ewer or anointed vessel. Bishops in resplendent vestments processed before him, chanting ancient liturgies that resonated through the vaulted ceilings. Incense smoke curled in gilded spirals around towering pillars, and the hush that descended each time a hymn rose seemed almost sacred. As part of the ritual, 4 sponsors, 3 dukes, and a duchess pledged their fealty and support, each stepping forward to hold the infant aloft before the congregation. They spoke solemn vows on his behalf, to counsel him wisely, to protect him honourably, and to uphold the realm's Protestant faith. Upon the renunciation of the devil, The child's tiny fingers were dipped in holy water and sealed with the sign of the cross. The final anointing was performed with chrism oil drawn from Jerusalem, symbolizing divine blessing and unity with the ancient traditions of Christendom. Outside the cathedral, throngs gathered as the bells tolled once more. The streets were strewn with petals of rose and lavender, and minstrels played joyous airs on lutes and shawms. Even common folk who had never glimpsed a royal face felt connected to the moment, believing that a new era had dawned, a time when the wounds of past conflicts would heal under this child's gentle rule. Yet, beneath the splendour and proclamations, the seeds of Edward's undoing had already been sown. His fragile body, kept in a bubble of overwork and superstition, had no chance to develop the strength its new role required. The same fervour that showered him with grandeur also girdled him in isolation, sterilizing his environment to the point that his young immune system never learned to defend itself. Unseen by the crowd, the fragile prince lay snug in his cradle, unaware of the grand vows made in his name, as the spectre of mortality already hovered at his tiny cradle's foot. And so, even at the height of celebration, the Tudor court failed to see that the very measures taken to protect the new prince had also rendered him vulnerable to the relentless forces of disease, a vulnerability that would, in the years to come, unravel the hopes of a kingdom. The atmosphere of paranoia surrounding Edward's health took hold almost from the moment he first opened his eyes. Henry VIII, who had waited 28 years for a legitimate male heir, treated his son less like a boy and more like a priceless relic to be safeguarded at all costs. The infant's nursery at Hampton Court was scrubbed with vinegar each morning, and during plague seasons, this ritual occurred twice daily. Every person who approached him, whether a duke in gilded robes or the humblest chambermaid, was first required to wash their hands in rosewater, and their well-being certified by the royal physicians. The walls of Edward's chamber were washed weekly with lime water to stave off disease, while every morsel of food destined for his lips was tested by 3 different tasters before it reached his mouth. This obsessive protection, though born of love and fear, wrought a cruel irony. In seeking to preserve his life, they may have unwittingly created an environment harmful to his development. Isolated from other children and shielded from everyday germs, Edward grew up within a sterile bubble that likely inhibited the proper maturation of his immune system. No child's play in the gardens, no shared laughter with youthful companions, only the hush of candlelit corridors and the distant clink of sweetmeat trays being readied for his delight. Dr. Christopher Langton, one of the prince's attending physicians, would later hypothesize that the very measures intended to protect Edward may have exacerbated his string of illnesses. Removed from ordinary childhood exposures touching garden soil, inhaling the scent of freshly chopped herbs in the courtyard, playing hide-and-seek with the pages, Edward's body lacked the opportunity to build natural defences against the myriad pathogens of Tudor England. When disease finally breached his carefully maintained barriers, it struck with greater force than it might have otherwise. The first signs of Edward's physical frailty emerged when he was but 4 years old. In the year 1541, court records euphemistically reference a quartan fever, a term that whispers of malaria rather than a benign chill. This illness laid him low for weeks, confining him to his bed and drawing forth the deep anxiety of his father. Henry, his temper as fearsome as ever, flew into a rage at the mere thought that his precious son might succumb. Physicians were dismissed on the spot, their reputations and livelihoods threatened, and newer doctors were summoned, each facing the unspoken threat of execution should Edward fail to recover. Yet the prince did arise from that first grave illness, only to reveal a subtle change. His vitality had diminished, and he now tired easily. His tutors observed that young Edward struggled to keep pace during lessons. His once keen mind seemed fogged by persistent fatigue. Activities that should have been simple pleasures, playing with a wooden hoop, galloping atop a pony, left him breathless and pale. Still, the court's public face remained resolute. Chronicles extolled Edward's boundless intelligence and firm bearing, never a hint of his lingering weakness. In the hush of the royal chambers, however, Edward's cough became a soft, persistent echo. It began as a polite tickle in his throat, barely audible above the susurrus of rustling silk and whispered prayers. Over time, it deepened into a dry, rasping sound that resonated against tapestry and woodwork. Each spasm shook his slender frame, and each night, the servant stationed nearby sprinkled fragrant herbs upon his pillow to mask the metallic aroma of blood and the acrid tang of bile when he retched. By the time Edward reached the age of 7, he had weathered 2 more serious illnesses, each more severe than the last. Chroniclers, ever mindful of Tudor pride, minimized these episodes in official accounts, but private letters between ambassadors told another tale. One dispatch noted that the prince's cheeks were sallow, his eyes ringed with dark halos. Another described mysterious rashes that marred his skin with painful welts, and digestive troubles that confined him to the blandest fare. Despite this, the propaganda machine churned on, portraying a thriving heir to the realm. Henry's fervour to protect his son persisted even as whispers of Edward's continued frailty grew louder. He ordered that the prince's garments be renewed with antiseptic vinegar washes, that his pillows be stuffed with only the finest lavender to ward off evil airs, and that his windows remain tightly latched, sealing out any hint of the outside world. The nursery, once a place of gentle lullabies, became an echoing chamber of ritual and restraint. Still, Edward persevered, beset by the callous hand of mortality, yet sustained by the devout faith of his advisers. They read scripture beside his bed, urging him to trust in divine providence. They placed crucifixes at each corner of his cradle, lit candles before nightfall, and whispered benedictions in Latin so that even if his voice failed, his soul might remain steadfast. Thus, beneath the veneer of royal ceremony and ceaseless vigilance, Edward's life unfolded like a fragile manuscript, each page stained by the ink of fear, each line a testament to the paradox of a boy prince, kept safe from common ills, only to fall victim to unseen forces that no human artifice could repel. In that quiet struggle, the irony of his fate was made plain. The very bubble meant to preserve his existence may have sealed his vulnerability instead. The boy recovered, but those who watched him closely could see that he never regained his former vitality. His tutors reported that he grew fatigued easily during lessons, and activities that should have been simple delights for a young prince, riding, archery, even the graceful sport of tennis, would leave him utterly exhausted, sometimes feverish for days afterward. By the age of 7, Edward had already endured 2 more severe illnesses, episodes that official chronicles downplayed in an effort to preserve the image of a thriving heir. Yet private correspondence between foreign ambassadors revealed the unvarnished truth. The prince suffered from recurring respiratory infections that left him breathless, mysterious rashes that broke out across his skin in painful welts, and gastrointestinal troubles that permitted him to retain only the blandest sustenance in his weakened state. Despite these afflictions, the Tudor propaganda machine churned on at full throttle, presenting Edward as a robust and flourishing monarch in the making. Portraits depicted him with clear eyes and rosy cheeks. Proclamations lauded his diligent study of scripture and statecraft. But those who stood at his bedside knew a very different reality, for the cough that racked his slender frame was never far from stifled sobs, and the tremor in his hand sometimes caused his quill to scratch jagged lines upon the parchment. When Henry VIII finally breathed his last in the month of January 1547, 9-year-old Edward ascended to the throne of England, an enormous burden for a child so physically unprepared. Contemporary accounts of his coronation ceremony offer telling details. The elaborate procession was shortened, for the young king could not stand for the full length of the traditional ceremony. His head, already heavy with the weight of responsibility, ached beneath the golden crown that symbolized his authority. Doctors later confided that he suffered daily headaches in the weeks that followed. When the courtiers attempted to guide him down the great aisle of Westminster Abbey, they quickly discovered that he lacked the strength to walk the entire distance. Thus, part of the route saw Edward borne aloft in a ceremonial chair, carried by 8 of the kingdom's steadfast guards, their steps measured to maintain the illusion of regal dignity. Official chronicles that emerged in the days after the coronation speak only of Edward's dignity, intelligence, and regal-bearing qualities, befitting a monarch ordained by divine right. Yet behind the scenes, a different struggle unfolded. His uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, assumed the role of Lord Protector, charged with steering both the realm and the frail child monarch through uncertain times. Somerset's private papers, unearthed centuries later, contain detailed instructions to the royal physicians: conceal the king's weakness, position courtiers to steady him at council meetings, and commission artists to depict him in poses suggesting strength. Indeed, Somerset faced the unprecedented task of governing not merely a kingdom but a chronically ill child king, whose very survival seemed contingent on the delicate balance of power and public perception. By the late spring of 1547, Edward's routine had settled into an uneasy pattern. Each morning, he would awaken with the leftover hammering in his skull, a gift from the crown he wore only because protocol demanded it. A council of physicians, some summoned from the continent, would press their fingers to his chest, listening for the telltale crackle of fluid, the sign that his lungs had again succumbed to infection. They would chart his pulse, measure the swelling in his ankles, and offer potions to soothe his stomach, all the while knowing that their remedies were rudimentary at best. Lessons continued in the great hall, where tutors sat beside their scholar king, reading aloud from Latin texts and guiding him through treatises on governance. But it was clear that the prince's attention drifted during each session. His head would droop, eyelids fluttering as if weighed down by unseen burdens. Occasionally, he would raise quivering hands to stifle a cough, letting loose a soft but rattling inhale that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. He still managed, on occasion, to deliver a passage in its original tongue, his inflection precise, a poignant reminder of the brilliance trapped within his frail frame. Physical exercise, once intended to build strength, became a trial of endurance. On the practice field, he would mount a gentle pony and attempt to guide it in measured circles. After only a few laps, his face would pale, and he would dismount unsteadily. Archery practice, too, turned grim. Drawn bowstrings strained his arms, and the exertion caused beads of sweat to gather on his brow, his breath coming in short gasps. A tutor or guard would step forward with a flask of spiced wine, which he would sip carefully, hoping to quell the nausea that often followed exertion. Despite the risks, these exercises persisted both as a matter of royal expectation and as a hopeful attempt to fortify his failing constitution. Yet each test of his strength seemed only to confirm that the boy king's body was ill-equipped for the mantle of power thrust upon it. And still, Somerset and his council pressed on, teaching Edward the rituals of state and the finer points of law, while shielding him, as best they could, from the knowledge that his reign might be as fragile as the health that sustained it. And so, the child monarch, crowned in gold, taught in marble halls, and protected by an anxious court, continued his reign under a veil of vigilant care, his every breath a testament to the precarious intersection of youthful promise and mortal frailty. Somerset's private papers, unearthed centuries later, contained painstaking instructions for the royal physicians on how to conceal the king's frailty. Courtiers were drilled in the art of positioning themselves so that if Edward swayed during a ceremony, a discreet hand or shoulder would steady him without drawing attention to his weakness. Painters received explicit orders to depict the young monarch in poses that suggested vitality and strength, with shoulders squared and chin held high, even if Edward himself could barely lift his head. A sophisticated network of stand-ins and doubles was organized for public appearances. When the king was too ill to attend, an appropriate look-alike would take his place behind a carefully arranged curtain or a strategically placed throne, ensuring that any absence would go unnoticed by the eager onlookers. Meanwhile, the medical records from Edward's early reign, though deliberately vague and frequently encoded, reveal a story of gradual decline. Physicians noted that the king suffered from what they termed rheums, a catch-all phrase, likely referring to chronic sinusitis and lingering respiratory infections. These ailments plagued him with constant headaches and difficulty breathing, forcing him to pause often as he walked through palace corridors or sat in council meetings. His tutors and attendants whispered of coughing fits that left Edward clutching at his chest, struggling to draw the next breath. By the time Edward reached the age of 12, his physical growth lagged noticeably behind that of his peers. In public, he seemed a diminutive figure, limbs so skinny they appeared little more than pale saplings, and a distended belly that betrayed signs of malnutrition, ironic given the sumptuous diet of the court. Yet no amount of roasted swan or sugared fruit could mask the truth that his body was failing to absorb even the finest nourishment. Night after night, the sheets of his bed would be soaked through with sweat, the telltale sign of endless night sweats. Each dawn revealed fresh, damp impressions in the linen, requiring multiple clean sets before Edward could rest again. Worse still was the persistent cough that accompanied him through his sleep. As he lay in the hush of his chamber, a soft rattling would build in his throat until he could hold it back no longer. Then a violent paroxysm would shudder through him, expelling a bitter mixture of phlegm stained with blood. These classic signs of tuberculosis seemed to go unrecognized, or were at least carefully ignored by the royal physicians. It was as though acknowledging the true nature of his illness would have spelled an end to hope for the kingdom. The spring of 1550 marked a critical turn in Edward's health. An official notice described his affliction as a mild case of measles, but the severity of his symptoms and the permanent pockmarks that later appeared suggest something far more sinister, a case of smallpox. For weeks, the boy king languished in delirium, his body racked by fever so intense that he would cry out in half-formed sentences, sometimes calling for his deceased father. Painful pustules erupted across his face and torso, each weeping with putrid fluid that crusted into yellow scabs. When those scabs sloughed off, they left permanent pits on once smooth skin, a cruel testament to the virulence of the disease. As the smallpox raged through him, Edward's weakened form could do little to resist the onslaught. The open sores served as gateways for further infection, and it was not long before he developed a cascade of complications. His joints began to ache unbearably, suggesting rheumatic trouble, and his persistent cough deepened, hinting that the tuberculosis within was seizing the opportunity to advance. The very blood he coughed up carried traces of the smallpox toxin, mingling with the remnants of prior ailments in a toxic brew that no Tudor remedy could counter. Throughout this ordeal, the court maintained its facade of calm. Reports to foreign ambassadors contained carefully chosen phrases: "His Majesty rests," "The Prince's fever abates," while behind the curtain, Somerset's network of doubles prepared for the moment when Edward could no longer sit for his portrait. Painters practiced capturing the likeness of the stand-in, honing each brushstroke to mimic Edward's ethereal complexion and regal bearing. Meanwhile, the chambermaids laboured in secret, changing bedding so often that they worked through stacks of linen as tall as the palace steps. In this quiet war against unseen enemies, the young monarch fought for every breath, and yet the machinery of state refused to acknowledge defeat. No matter the visible evidence of his failing body, the sunken cheeks, the hollow cough, the scars pitted across his face, the kingdom insisted on presenting an image of unwavering strength. Sleep would come slowly to Edward, each night punctuated by the gentle drip of sweat and the rattle of his lungs, a lullaby of suffering that echoed through the silent halls of Hampton Court. As Edward's body continued its slow surrender, his joints began to swell and ache, with a sharpness that spoke of rheumatic complications. The once supple limbs of the prince, accustomed to youthful play, now carried the weight of persistent inflammation. Each morning, he would rise from his bed to find his ankles and wrists stiff and tender, as though the very framework of his body were rebelling against his fragile existence. The faint sunlight that crept through the curtains found him hunched and pale, hands propped on the edge of his mattress to ease the dolorous stiffness. It was during these months of increasing physical distress that the power struggle between Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and John Dudley, soon to be Duke of Northumberland, grew more intense. Both men recognised that the young king's time was limited. The question was no longer whether Edward would die, but when. Somerset, as Lord Protector, strove to maintain the traditional line of succession, while Dudley manoeuvred behind the scenes, positioning himself and his allies for the inevitable crisis. Court whispers spoke of midnight councils and coded dispatches, each plotting a course to the throne that would follow Edward's passing. Somerset's fate, however, was sealed. Charges of treason were brought against him in the spring of 1552, and he was executed despite pleas that mercy be shown to the king's uncle. In the aftermath, Northumberland emerged as the de facto ruler of England, bearing the true reins of power, while Edward's own authority waned like the final embers of a dying fire. The prince, once surrounded by tutors and noble guardians, now found himself increasingly isolated in both body and spirit. Capable enough to grasp the nature of his circumstances, Edward confided in his diary a haunting sense of imprisonment. He wrote of feeling a prisoner in my own palace, confined by the very walls that were meant to cradle him. And more heartbreakingly, he described how those who watched him regarded him not as a child or a king, but as a temporary obstacle to be removed once his usefulness had ended. The poignant lines of his journal revealed a young mind throbbing with awareness. He understood that each gasp for breath brought him closer to the end, and that the ambitions of powerful men dwarfed even his own royal destiny. Yet Northumberland's relationship with Edward was not purely one of exploitation. In a curious blend of political calculation and genuine concern, the the Duke made efforts to secure the best medical care for the ailing monarch. Recognizing that English physicians, bound by court politics, might hesitate to speak plainly, John Dudley invited renowned specialists from the continent to attend the prince. Physicians from Italy, France, and the Low Countries journeyed to England, bearing knowledge and treatments less constrained by Tudor intrigue. One such figure was the eminent Italian physician and polymath, Dr. Girolamo Cardano. In 1552, Cardano was summoned to Greenwich Palace and granted a rare audience with Edward. The Duke hoped that the doctor's reputation for honesty would yield an accurate prognosis. Privately, Cardano recorded his solemn assessment. The king, he believed, had perhaps 2 years remaining at most, certainly no more than 3. He noted Edward's laboured breathing, the characteristic night sweats, and the emaciation that no diet, however luxurious, could reverse. His report, smuggled into continental archives, survives as a testament to the tragic calculus of a monarch's lifespan. Edward himself was not blind to his waning days. His personal writings from this period reflect a young man wrestling with his own mortality against the backdrop of his Protestant faith. He admitted to moments when his spirit faltered under the weight of pain. Yet he wrote of striving to remain steadfast, for England and for God's true religion. In passages marked by delicate penmanship, he described the solace of Scripture, memorizing psalms to fortify his courage. He expressed hope that his suffering might serve a higher purpose, a test of faith akin to the trials of old. Despite the ministrations of foreign healers and the fervent prayers of his chaplains, Edward's condition worsened. His cough deepened into a wet, racking sound, and the fluid he expelled bore the sanguine stain of advanced illness. His joints, once only mildly stiff, grew so painful that tutors and servants approached him with gentle caution, wary of triggering fresh waves of agony. Each council meeting found the boy king propped upon cushions, his posture carefully arranged to mask the tremors that coursed through him. In the lonely hours of the night, when the castle corridors lay silent and the moonlight pooled in the windows, Edward would sometimes awaken in a haze. He would whisper fragments of prayer into the darkness, beseeching divine mercy for a kingdom he could no longer protect in body or spirit. The hush around him preserved these moments of intimate confession, for even courtiers dreaded to disturb a monarch in such vulnerable repose. Thus, as the year 1552 waned into the cold months of winter, the frailty of Edward VI became both an unspoken tragedy and a political inevitability. The machinations of Somerset and Northumberland, the solemn prophecies of Cardano, and the prince's own journal entries wove together into a tapestry of sorrow. In the hush of those candlelit chambers, the boy who once embodied the Tudor dream lay on the threshold of history, his every breath a wisp of hope and despair fused into one. "My body fails daily," Edward confided in one particularly poignant journal entry. "Yet my spirit must remain strong for England and for God's true religion." In those words lies the essence of the young king's final desperate strength, a resolve to lift his nation, even as his own flesh betrayed him. He threw himself into religious study and the work of reform with an intensity that alarmed even his staunchest Protestant advisers. It was as though Edward believed he could compress a lifetime of spiritual transformation into whatever days remained to him. By the year 1552, Edward's physical decline had become increasingly hard to conceal. The imperial ambassadors reported that the king's visage took on an almost spectral quality. His cheeks had hollowed, as though wind-swept dunes had replaced the softness of youth. His eyes lay sunken in their sockets, dark rings outlining each orb like bruises. His skin carried a translucent sheen, through which pale blue veins showed plainly an effect that only heightened the sense of otherworldliness. In every recorded observation, Edward's frame was described as slight and gaunt, a boy king, who seemed more apparition than flesh and blood monarch. Even his hands, once capable of signing majestic proclamations, trembled constantly. During council meetings, attendants would place cushions at strategic angles beneath his elbows and around his back, propping him upright so that he could meet the gaze of his councillors without appearing to falter. Yet even this artifice could not fully disguise the ravages within. When Edward raised his quill, his stroke wavered. Letters trailed into ink smudges and uneven lines, as though his body shook in silent protest. The contrast with portraits painted only 2 years earlier was striking. Then, the artist had captured a prince with bright, resolute eyes, and a firm jaw images meant to project confidence and continuity for the Tudor dynasty. Now, the prince before foreign envoys resembled something more macabre. Some speculated whispered rumours that he had been poisoned, a suspicion that seemed plausible given the number of powerful figures who stood to benefit from his demise. Investigations into possible poisoning were indeed launched both during Edward's lifetime and after his death, but ultimately found no evidence that toxins were involved. Instead, Edward's symptoms aligned perfectly with a progressive case of tuberculosis, possibly complicated by what modern medicine would recognize as chronic kidney disease. The persistent swelling of his extremities, his legs and arms puffed with fluid, spoke of renal failure. Reports described his urine as dark and foul-smelling, an unmistakable sign of uremia. Meanwhile, fluid accumulated in his abdomen, creating a distended belly that further sapped his strength. These were classic hallmarks of kidney dysfunction secondary to long-standing infection. By the autumn of 1552, Edward's condition had deteriorated to the point that even the most optimistic propaganda could not obscure the truth. In November of that year, he appeared before the public for the last time, his presence a sombre pageant of faded grandeur. Among the watchers was the imperial ambassador Charles V, who sent a dispatch to his master describing the king as resembling a living corpse. Vividly, he predicted that Edward would not survive the coming winter, a prognosis borne out within months. The once bright hopes of a revitalized Tudor realm, championed by this child king's piety and promise, now seemed little more than a fragile dream. Edward's slow march toward death had become a symbol of the dynasty's vulnerability. The very body meant to secure England's Protestant future had been betrayed by the relentless advance of disease. And though his mind remained keen, ever locked in contemplation of scripture and reform, his weary frame could no longer serve as the vessel for that divine mission. Thus, as the winds turned chill and the castle corridors grew quiet, Edward's final public appearance marked the closing scene of his brief but tumultuous reign. The ambassador's words, like a living corpse, linger as chilling testimony to the young monarch's fate. In those last days of 1552, Edward VI stood at the threshold between history and legend, a boy whose body failed him utterly, yet whose spirit burned at full intensity for England and for the faith he so dearly cherished. Edward survived, yet the cost was a profound loss of whatever remained of his quality of life. The winter of 1552 to 1553 became a nightmarish ordeal of suffering that the boy king endured with remarkable fortitude for someone scarcely more than 15 winters old. The tuberculosis that had ravaged his lungs now infiltrated his very bones, triggering pain so searing that no measure of opium could fully quell the agony. Each breath became a struggle, and each movement a fresh torment. His spine, once straight and noble, began to curve under the weight of his illness. The courtiers, ever vigilant in preserving the outward dignity of the monarchy, commissioned specially tailored garments to mask the developing hunch. Fine velvets and meticulously structured doublets concealed the stoop, but they could not hide the truth that Edward's posture betrayed his failing body. His shoulders drew inward, and the line of his back lost its proud ascent, bending gradually with each passing day. Within his lungs, ongoing infection gave rise to searing abscesses, pockets of pus that formed and ruptured in cycles too frequent to count. When these pockets burst, Edward would choke and cough until his thin frame shook violently, expelling a greasy mixture of fluid and blood in horrid torrents. Servants stood by with damp cloths, their hearts aching as they watched the boy they served convulse with each fit. The air in his bedchamber grew so laden with the stench of decay and the sour tang of infection that his attendants found themselves burning bundles of fragrant herbs constantly, hoping in vain to mask the odor. Mounds of laurel, rosemary, and lavender smouldered in braziers, casting drifting spirals of smoke that could not cleanse the heavy air. Even the thin sunlight that filtered through the chamber's narrow windows seemed reluctant to dispel the gloom. Spring of 1553 arrived, yet brought no respite, only an acceleration of Edward's decline. The swelling that had once been confined to his legs now spread to every limb and joint, a condition known to physicians as anasarca. Waterlogged flesh clung to his bones, and his entire body assumed a grotesque puffiness. His face ballooned so drastically that his eyes were reduced to mere slits, sunken beneath layers of swollen tissue. His fingers, once nimble at signing documents, had grown so stiff and thick that his cherished signet rings had to be cut off, a painful procedure he endured in silence, his heart beating a dull drum of sorrow and fatigue. The skin on his legs, stretched beyond its limits, broke open to weep clear fluid that dripped through bandages in mere hours, necessitating constant changes of linens and dressings. The servants, weary from their ceaseless ministrations, whispered among themselves that his condition was beyond all mortal remedy. Modern medical understanding recognizes these harbingers as classic signs of total organ failure. His kidneys, unable to filter toxins from his blood, let fluid accumulate. His liver, overwhelmed by the combined onslaught of infection and chemical treatments, could no longer sustain its vital functions. And his heart, that emblem of regal vigor, labored under the burden of a body swelled to grotesque proportions, its chambers strained and faltering. Amid this physical collapse, the darkest political manipulations unfolded. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, fully grasped that Edward's death was imminent, and that the next in line would be his half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic. Driven by ambition and fear of a reversal of religious reforms, Northumberland orchestrated one final, macabre act of statecraft. He visited the sick chamber frequently, his footsteps echoing in the hushed corridors as though he were treading on air itself. There, amid dripping bandages and the stench of decay, he leaned over the frail boy so pale and gaunt, yet still bearing the royal dignity of his line, and persuaded him to sign the Device for the Succession, a document intended to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Lady Jane Grey. With a hand guided by Northumberland's own, Edward's trembling fingers traced the shape of his name across the parchment, each quivering stroke a testament to his waning strength and the ruthless resolve of those around him. This moment, more than any other, encapsulated the tragedy of Edward's final months. A boy, already a prisoner of his own flesh, found himself made puppet to the ambitions of men who whispered of Protestant continuity even as they exploited his agony. The very document that bore his name would outlast his life, setting in motion a brief and tragic 9-day reign for his cousin Jane and plunging the realm into further turmoil. And so, as the verdant promise of spring unfurled outside the windows of Greenwich Palace, Edward's world contracted to the narrow confines of his death chamber. Each breath, each pulse, each heartbeat marked not only the slow dissolution of his own mortal frame, but the unravelling of the Tudor dream he had been born to inherit. In the shaded quiet of those final days, the line between king and child, between ruler and victim, blurred until only the painful truth remained, that even a monarch could be destroyed by the very life he was meant to preserve. The device for the succession that Edward signed, or, more precisely, that John Dudley guided the prince's swollen hand to authorise, was designed to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's own daughter-in-law. This document stands as both testament and epitaph to Edward's deterioration. In the first draft, his signature, simply the name Edward written in firm, confident script, spoke of regal authority. By the final version, however, the once proud letters had degenerated into an almost illegible scrawl, each stroke betraying the weakness that overcame his body and hand. Such physical decline was paired with a torment of the mind that equalled his bodily suffering. Edward, reared to believe unreservedly in his divine right to rule and his solemn duty to protect Protestant England, was confronted daily with his own absolute powerlessness. Here was a monarch who could not command his own limbs without pain, could not swallow without retching, and could not even sign his own name with ease. Yet he remained king in name alone, unable to govern his own body, let alone a nation. Attendants stationed themselves just beyond the bed's warm glow of candlelight, their faces drawn with worry. They later recounted episodes when Edward cried out in delirious agony, calling for his late father, Henry VIII, or beseeching God either to heal him or end his suffering. In those moments, his voice, hoarse from relentless coughing, rose to a pitch that echoed through the stone corridors, a piercing testament to his despair. At other times, he would lie utterly silent for hours on end, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above. Observers spoke of those distant gazes as though he had already glimpsed the world beyond mortal life, his soul wandering where they could not follow. The medical care Edward received in those final months represented the pinnacle of Tudor medicine, sophisticated for its era, yet often harmful by modern standards. Leading his medical team was Dr. Thomas Wendy, a physician esteemed by the court yet operating within the confines of pre-modern understanding. Wendy and his colleagues spared no effort to apply every treatment in their arsenal, each chosen in hopes of miraculous restoration. Bloodletting was routine. Leeches were applied to his arms and legs to draw off excess humours. And in the most desperate measures, cups were used to make small incisions, bleeding the prince until he lost pints of blood at a time. His weakened body, already starved by disease, could ill afford such loss. But the doctors believed that purging the bad humours would restore balance to his afflicted system. Next came the application of blistering agents to his chest substances, meant to raise painful welts called blisters or fomentations, designed to draw out what physicians termed the evil humours. These plasters created raw, burning sores that quickly became infected, adding fresh wounds to Edward's failing flesh. Attendants whispered that the smell of these burning compounds, often containing irritants like cantharides, mixed with the stench of his decaying lungs to create an atmosphere almost unbearable in its acridity. Potions followed: mercury, arsenic, and antimony administered in compound elixirs. Each liquid carried the promise of cure, but often delivered further harm. Mercury caused tremors and salivation. Arsenic brought nausea and organ damage. Antimony induced vomiting so violent that Edward's fragile frame shook with convulsions. Though some contemporaries believed these substances held the key to subduing disease, in reality they likely hastened his organ failure rather than halted it. Throughout this litany of treatments, Edward's own agency dwindled. He consented to each procedure with a weary resignation, trusting that the court's finest skills might yet save him, even as his body rebelled at every intervention. His diary entries grew ever more poignant, capturing not only the physical torment, but the existential anguish of a king forced to endure the very treatments that betrayed him. In private moments, away from the courtier's watchful eyes, Edward would murmur to his chaplain about his dual desire for relief and release. He spoke of a kingdom he longed to heal, of religious reforms he wished to see fulfilled, and yet acknowledged that his own mortal frame seemed destined to collapse before those dreams could be realized. Each bloodletting felt like a surrender of strength. Each blister raised on his chest felt like another barrier between him and the life he once knew. And still, the court pressed on portraits were retouched to hide the worst of his decline. The device stood ready to be enforced, and the machinery of state refused to acknowledge the depth of his suffering. In those final days, Edward existed in a realm of paradox, revered as a sovereign, yet powerless before the very treatments designed to save him. He was simultaneously the kingdom's hope and its greatest casualty, a boy king caught in a fatal interplay of faith, power, and the limits of contemporary medicine. Thus, as the candles guttered in the silent Tudor chamber, Edward VI remained bound to his throne by both divine ordination and human frailty. The device for the succession, the blisters and bleeding, the trembling signature, all these wove together into the tragic tapestry of his end. A sovereign undone, not by conspirators alone, but by the relentless advance of his own illness and the very remedies meant to preserve him. Perhaps the most haunting detail of Edward's final months was the gradual abandonment by those who had once surrounded him in healthier days. His courtiers, unable to withstand the sight and odour of their ailing monarch, found every excuse to avoid the death chamber. They whispered of urgent audiences elsewhere, feigned illness, or claimed pressing duties in distant corners of the palace. The cloying stench, the sour mingling of infected wounds, sweat, and the fetid breath of tuberculosis proved too much, even for the most stalwart noble. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, stoically limited his visits to the bare minimum required to maintain his political grip. He stood at the threshold, offered brief words of state counsel, and departed swiftly, leaving behind only the echo of his boots on the marble floor. Only a handful of servants bound by duty, and perhaps by genuine compassion, remained at Edward's bedside, to tend to the boy's most intimate needs. These nameless individuals bore witness to unspeakable horrors. They cleansed his festering wounds, changed the soiled bedding that hung in tatters, and held cups of water to his cracked lips when he could no longer lift his head. These loyal attendants became the true chroniclers of Edward's demise, their labour unseen in official annals, yet crucial to the boy king's final comfort. Political necessity demanded that records of his suffering be suppressed, for any acknowledgement of his true condition might fracture the fragile facade of Tudor strength. And yet fragments of this truth endure in the most unexpected places. In the papers of a minor noble family lies an account of the royal laundry, Servants burned Edward's bedsheets rather than attempt to clean them, deeming the stains left by bodily fluids so corrosive and dark that they resembled maps of unknown, terrible lands. The images are both grotesque and poetic stains, etched into linen, as if cartographers had drawn the outlines of some hellish kingdom. Likewise, a carpenter's invoice for repairs to the king's chamber lists charges for replacing floorboards irreparably eaten away by the same corrosive fluids. These mundane records speak volumes about the physical dissolution that no court historian dared to admit. By the 5th month of 1553, Edward could no longer rise from his bed. The constant pressure of his weight against the mattress had given rise to deep pressure ulcers, some so severe that bone lay exposed through the broken skin. His scalp, once crowned with a tuft of Tudor red hair, was now entirely bare, covered in scale-like scabs and open sores that oozed clear fluid by the hour. His teeth, loosened by the ravages of malnutrition and systemic infection, wobbled in their sockets. Several had already fallen, forcing him to muffle his speech into incoherent whispers. In those final quiet hours, Edward lay surrounded by staleness and decay, a king in name yet little more than a tormented child. The sheets he once clutched like a security blanket now lay in charred remnants on pyres beyond the palace walls. The floor beneath his bed had been replaced piece by piece, until only fresh timber remained, for the odours had penetrated deep into the rotting boards, defying all attempts at purification. Yet even as his body unravelled, Edward's mind flickered with the sharp glow of conscience. He listened to the sobs of lonely servants changing his bandages and, in rare lucid moments, offered prayers a testament to his enduring piety. He expressed gratitude to the few who stayed at his side, acknowledging that they alone had honoured their vows of service. These whispered words were his final benedictions, small miracles of grace amid the overwhelming horror. No grand chronicle would record these acts of mercy. Instead, they exist only in the margins, a charred scrap of linen, a yellowing invoice, a nurse's hushed diary entry. Together, they form a mosaic of abandonment and devotion, revealing the world that Edward inhabited in his last days. It was a realm ruled not by regal decree, but by the crises of decay and the flickering humanity of those few who dared to remain. And so, as the spring of 1553 gave way to summer, Edward VI's life dwindled to its final embers. Surrounded by absence, yet attended by a handful of devoted souls, he drifted between consciousness and sleep, between prayer and delirium. The Tudor court, eager to preserve its image, shut its eyes to his suffering. But in those shadowed moments of isolation, the reality of Edward's end shone more clearly than any royal decree. It was there, in the quiet devotion of anonymous servants and the charred remnants of his chamber, that the true story of his final days was etched, an epitaph written not in ink, but in sweat, tears, and blood. When foreign ambassadors came bearing urgent requests for proof that the young king still drew breath, they were guided into Edward's chamber, though only to its threshold. There, behind a heavy curtain and at a measured distance, they glimpsed a vague form swathed in thick blankets. From that shrouded shape came faint, muffled sounds, weak rasping murmurs presented as royal commands, echoes of a monarch too diminished to project his voice clearly. The ambassadors, accustomed to courts where pageantry and power went hand in hand, exchanged uneasy glances. They understood that these indecipherable utterances were meant to convey sovereign authority, yet the effect was more haunting than commanding. It is particularly poignant to consider what treatments might have saved Edward had he lived in another era. Modern antibiotics could have cured his tuberculosis, halting the rot in his lungs before it spread to bone. Renal dialysis might have addressed his failing kidneys, flushing toxins from his blood and restoring balance to his body. Basic nutritional support, intravenous feeds, or fortified supplements could have prevented much of the wasting that left him a hollow shell. But in Tudor England, despite all the privileges of his royal station, Edward was condemned to a slow dissolution that no crown or courtly decorum could arrest. The bitter irony is that his very rank, the status meant to protect and preserve him, actually prolonged his agony, for political necessity demanded that he be kept alive as long as possible. June of 1553 marked the final phase of Edward's ordeal. By this time, his weight had plummeted until the outlines of his ribs and hip bones could be traced through his skin, pale and taut like parchment stretched over fragile wood. Yet his abdomen remained distended, a bloated husk filled with fluid that no amount of bleeding or blistering could drain. This grotesque contrast emaciated limbs wrapped around a swollen midsection shocked even hardened medical professionals. They whispered among themselves that the boy king had become a living paradox. Ancient mariner's lantern bones afloat on a sea of dropsy. His breathing had deteriorated to the point that he could only manage shallow, desperate gasps. Observers noted that his chest barely moved, as though each breath required a monumental effort. The wet, rattling wheeze that issued from his throat was the death rattle of a sovereign, the herald of his final hours, an unceasing sound that filled the silent corridors both day and night. It served as a grim reminder that time was slipping away, each breath a convulsive victory snatched from the jaws of death. Layered atop the physical torments was the weight of religious meaning that Edward himself applied to his suffering. As a fervent Protestant one who had overseen some of England's most radical religious reforms, he viewed his affliction through a theological lens. To him, each pang of pain was not mere malady, but a trial ordained by God, a purgation of sin, and a crucible of faith. He believed that his pain, endured with patience and prayer, might serve the greater good of the church and the realm. His chaplain would record how Edward spent hours poring over holy texts, seeking solace in the Psalms and in the writings of early reformers. Passages that once seemed abstract doctrine now rang with vivid immediacy. The patience of Job, the endurance of Paul, the promise of ultimate deliverance. When the child king felt his strength ebb, he would whisper verses like, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," as if reciting a sacred mantra to steel his soul. In those moments, his faith became both balm and burden, for while it lent him courage, it also deepened the poignancy of his plight. He was a vessel of religious conviction, shackled by a failing body. Even ambassadors heard of these devout exercises. They reported that on rare afternoons, the attendants would glimpse Edward kneeling beside his bed, head bowed, lips quivering as he sought divine mercy. From those scraps of observation, a narrative emerged. The prince's suffering had assumed cosmic proportions. It was not merely a personal tragedy, but a theological drama, one in which the health of the nation and the purity of the faith were bound up in the fragile frame of a boy king. And so, as summer dawned on 1553, Edward's existence shrank to a series of shallow breaths, whispered prayers, and the endless echo of his own mortality. The chamber around him stood charged with both sacred hope and crushing despair. Each gasping inhale was an act of defiance, each prayer a hopeful stroke against the relentless tide of decay. In that hushed crucible, the young monarch confronted the limits of human endurance, the complexities of divine purpose, and the ultimate fragility of regal power. Thus concluded the last chapter of Edward VI's reign, a portrait not of triumph, but of transcendent suffering, where the boundaries between body and spirit blurred, and where every heartbeat was both a testament to faith and a farewell to life. Some of Edward's Protestant theologians sought to comfort him by likening his suffering to the trials of Job. They told him that, like the patriarch of old, his pain was a divinely appointed test, and that if he bore it with patient endurance, his reward would be heavenly glory. "Your affliction, sire," one minister assured him, "is the crucible in which your faith is refined. Endure, and an eternal crown awaits." Yet elsewhere in the court, Catholic observers whispered a very different interpretation. To them, Edward's illness was a form of divine punishment for his role in suppressing the true faith. They murmured that the wounds on his body were writ small in flesh and blood, a sacred chastisement for his zeal in dismantling ancient rites. Caught between these competing theological narratives, Edward appeared to waver. At times, he clung to the hope of miraculous healing, spending hours in prayer and reading scripture, convinced that some act of grace might restore his health. He would petition God with tremulous voice for deliverance from his torment, imagining that a divine touch could banish the scourge of disease. At other moments, however, he resigned himself to God's will, accepting that suffering might be ordained and that earthly release could only come in death. Witnesses noted that in his final days he sometimes spoke of longing for that release, viewing death not as defeat but as an emancipation from unremitting agony. On the 1st of July, in the year 1553, Edward suffered what appeared to be a stroke. The left side of his face drooped, rendering half his visage into a slack, distorted mask, and he lost all movement in his left arm. The words that once issued from his lips, already garbled by missing teeth, and a swollen tongue became entirely unintelligible. Yet amid this new horror, Edward remained conscious. His eyes, once bright with youthful resolve, now tracked every motion in the chamber, and on occasion they filled with tears as though he sought both comfort and forgiveness in the faces of his attendants. In a final act of desperate hope, Northumberland brought forth a woman who claimed to possess the gift of healing. She entered the chamber in a swirl of coloured veils and oil lamps, her voice soft with promised wonders. Edward, frail though he was, attempted to sit up only to falter and be gently eased back onto his pillows. The woman's features registered sympathy, perhaps even pity, as she gazed upon the dying monarch. Then, with a single shake of her head, she turned and fled the room, whispering that she could not cure that which God had claimed. In that fleeting moment, the futility of earthly remedies stood starkly revealed. The final 5 days of Edward's life were a descent into a nightmare that even the most hardened witnesses struggled to describe. His body exhibited signs that modern medicine would recognize as disseminated intravascular coagulation, DIC, a catastrophic failure of the blood's clotting mechanisms. Bruises the color of bruised grapes blossomed across his limbs where capillaries had burst, and spontaneous bleeding occurred from his nose, gums, and even his eyes. Each bleed was unpredictable. One moment he lay still, his breathing a soft rasp. The next, blood would trickle from a nostril or seep from a gum socket, staining the pillow and startling those nearby. When he could produce urine at all, it was nearly black, a dense, loamy stream reminiscent of tar, dark with the presence of blood. Such a sight would have spelled imminent death in any hospital ward. Yet in Tudor England, it was met with a hushed silence, as though naming the reality of his collapse might hasten its conclusion. The attendants, some trembling, some stone-faced, alternated between panicked attempts to staunch the bleeding and weary acceptance that nothing could ward off the end. Throughout these final hours, Edward lay in a state of half-wakefulness. He drifted between fevered delirium and moments of painful clarity. In delirium, he called out for his late father, for God's mercy, for deliverance from the pit of anguish that held him. In clarity, he murmured prayers of thanks to the handful of attendants who remained, expressing gratitude for their loyalty and kindness. His words, though faint, carried the weight of one who had seen both the glory and the abyss of human existence. His breathing, once a steady rhythm, became the death rattle in earnest, wet, gurgling inhalations that trembled through the night and into the dawn. Each breath seemed to draw from him the last embers of life, until, on a summer morning in July of 1553, Edward's spirit slipped away. The final gasp was soft and barely audible, a quiet exhalation that spoke more of resignation than struggle. Thus ended the brief reign of Edward VI, a boy king raised with divine promise, undone by illnesses untreatable in his era, and pursued to the final moment by the intertwining spectres of faith and politics. In his last days, he endured betrayals both physical and spiritual, clung to hope even as his body disintegrated, and ultimately found release in the one remedy no court could provide. In the hush that followed his passing, the Tudor court stood mute, for the death of a monarch is never merely a private sorrow but the closing of a chapter in the life of a nation. By the final days of Edward VI's life, the stench in his chamber had grown so overwhelming that even burning sulphur failed to mask the fetid odor. Braziers filled with lumps of brimstone were set alight in deliberate efforts to disinfect the air, but the sulphur smoke only mingled with the rank miasma until the two could not be distinguished. Guards posted at the door of the death chamber found their stout constitutions tested by the overwhelming reek. Every 60 minutes a fresh replacement would be summoned to stand sentinel, for even the hardiest soldier risked fainting from the rancid fumes. Then, on the morning of the 6th of July, 1553, Edward VI's long ordeal at last came to its gentle close. Sir John Bannister, one of the physicians who had remained through the prince's final agony, recorded that despite months of unrelenting pain, the king's final moments were surprisingly peaceful. The harsh rattles of his breath softened into shallow, measured inhales and exhales until, in a single hushed instant, they ceased altogether. There was no dramatic last speech, no final words of wisdom. The boy who had once carried the hopes of a nation drew one last fragile breath. then lay still, his life extinguished as quietly as a candle flickering out at dawn. He was 15 years of age and had reigned for 6.5 years, most of them consumed by chronic illness. In his death, the promise of his youth dissolved into silence, leaving behind only the echo of unfulfilled potential. Yet the grim business did not end with his passing. The immediate aftermath proved as macabre as the months leading to his last breath. His body, already in an advanced state of decomposition, required swift preparation for burial. A task customarily unpleasant, but here elevated to nightmare proportions. The embalmers, arriving with their tools and pitchers of aromatic oils, faced horrors beyond the ordinary. When they first opened the chest cavity, the internal organs collapsed into near-liquid form at the slightest touch. The lungs, once symbols of breath and life, resembled rotted sponges soaked in a brackish brew of blood and pus. These foul masses sloshed like viscous foam when stirred, releasing fresh waves of miasmic vapors that caused even the embalmers to stagger back in revulsion. The heart, the eternal emblem of courage and strength, lay enlarged to nearly twice its normal size. Its surface was encrusted with fibrous adhesions that tethered it to surrounding tissues in gruesome webbing. When cut, the organ exuded a dark, gelatinous fluid, staining the embalmer's linen wrappings. The liver and kidneys, too, bore the unmistakable marks of extensive damage. The liver, green, black, and brittle as decayed foliage, crumbled like old parchment, while the kidneys appeared shriveled and mottled with necrotic patches. These findings confirmed what modern medicine would diagnose as total organ failure, a tragic denouement to a life besieged by relentless disease. Despite the overwhelming decay, the embalmers set to work with grim resolve. They packed the cavity with vast quantities of spices, cloves, cinnamon, and myrrh, in hopes that strong aromas might counter the stench. Resinous gums were piled in layers, and preservatives drawn from distant shores, resin of pine, frankincense, and camphor, were poured generously over the remains. Even so, the progression of putrefaction outpaced their efforts. The body swelled with escaping gases, creaking within its wrappings as if protesting the bid for preservation. To contain the expansion, the embalmers encased the corpse in 3 nested coffins, the innermost of lead, then solid oak, and finally an outer shell of lead again. This triple barrier was meant not only to preserve what remained, but also to stanch the odours and prevent the build-up of gases from causing an internal explosion. Yet, even as the final lead lid settled, one could swear they heard muffled groans and the hiss of gas escaping through unseen cracks, a haunting testament to the living decay sealed within. Given the state of the body, traditional public display was impossible. The planned lying in state was abruptly cancelled, ostensibly out of respect for the Protestant faith that shunned ostentation, but more truthfully because the corpse would have been too repellent. Instead, an empty coffin, draped in cloth of gold and surrounded by heraldic banners, was presented to mourners. Only a few trusted guards were stationed in the sealed chamber housing Edward's remains, sworn to secrecy and prohibited from speaking of what they might hear or smell. The funeral itself, held on the 8th of August, 1553, at Westminster Abbey, was a solemn affair overshadowed by necessity. 8 of the strongest royal guards shouldered the massive, lead-laden coffin, their faces set in grim lines as they bore the rotting burden. Attendees noted that the coffin seemed to shift unnaturally, as if the internal gases were still at work, and at times they detected a faint, wet thud from within. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer delivered the sermon, praising Edward as a new Josiah, a boy king of reform, though few could reconcile the vision of a healthy sovereign with the hidden horrors entombed beneath. That night, workmen hurried to seal the tomb with additional layers of stone and mortar, some historians believe to prevent any exhumation that might expose the scandal of the decay. Others suggest it was a pragmatic measure to contain the odours. Yet despite such precautions, in the days that followed, rumours spread of strange sounds echoing from the vault, and even of dark fluid seeping through the ancient stones. Whether fact or fancy, these stories underscored the deep unease surrounding Edward's death and the state of his remains. Thus concluded the tragic final chapter of Edward VI's life. A boy king undone by disease, his passing as subdued as candlelight in a tomb, and his funeral, a testament to the lengths a kingdom would go to preserve its dignity, even as it grappled with the irrepressible truths of mortality and decay. In the hours following Edward VI's passing, his body began to swell grotesquely as internal gases built up from the rampant decay. The decision was made to seal the corpse in multiple nested coffins. First a lead container, then an oak shell, and finally another layer of lead, an elaborate attempt to contain both the odor and the pressure of gases that threatened to burst the seals. Despite these precautions, the guards stationed outside the tomb reported unsettling noises emanating from within, soft creaks and distant thumps that spoke of restless putrefaction pushing against its metallic prison. The planned public lying in state was abruptly cancelled. Officially, this was presented as an act of reverence for the late king's Protestant sensibilities, which frowned upon ostentatious displays of mortal remains. In truth, Edward's corpse was in no condition to be exhibited. Instead, an empty coffin draped in cloth of gold and encircled by banners bearing the royal arms was displayed for the mourning public. Meanwhile, the real coffin containing his remains was kept in a sealed chamber, guarded by a handful of sworn sentries who were forbidden to speak of what they might hear or smell within. The funeral proper took place on the 8th of August 1553 at Westminster Abbey, a ceremony meticulously choreographed to preserve the illusion of regal dignity. 8 of the kingdom's strongest men shouldered the heavy coffin not as a ceremonial honour, but out of necessity. The lead and oak, combined with the bloated remains within, made the bier almost impossibly heavy. Observers noted how the bearers swayed under the load, and there were moments when the coffin seemed to shift unnaturally, as though stirred by the gases and fluids trapped inside. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer delivered the funeral sermon, praising Edward as a new Josiah, a boy king in the Bible who enacted sweeping religious reforms in Israel. Yet those who had witnessed Edward's final months knew how apt the comparison truly was. Josiah too died young, and his reforms were swiftly undone. The Protestant Reformation that Edward had championed would indeed be reversed by his successor, Mary I, later dubbed Bloody Mary, for her ruthless persecution of Protestants. In an extraordinary rush, the burial concluded without the usual array of elaborate graveside rites. The coffin was lowered into the vault and immediately sealed. Workers arrived that very night to reinforce the tomb with additional layers of stone and mortar. Some historians argue that this haste was driven by a desire to prevent any post-mortem examination that might reveal the true extent of Edward's suffering or fuel rumours of poisoning. Others suggest it was a practical measure to contain the ongoing decomposition. In the days following the funeral, strange stories began to circulate. Guards at Westminster Abbey reported hearing sounds from the royal vault, not ghostly moans, but the unmistakable hiss of gases escaping from the sealed coffin. One sentry even claimed to have seen a dark, viscous fluid seeping through the cracks in the stones, though this account was quickly suppressed. Whether these tales were fact or embellishment, they spoke to a deep unease surrounding Edward's death and the condition of his remains. Beyond the mortuary mysteries, the political fallout was just as chaotic. Northumberland's attempt to install Lady Jane Grey on the throne lasted a mere 9 days before Mary Tudor's forces triumphed. Northumberland himself was executed, along with many of those who had manipulated Edward in his final months. It was as if the decay that had consumed Edward's body had spread to corrode the very structures of power he had left behind. The Tudor dynasty that Henry VIII had laboured so fiercely to establish and preserve was revealed in its aftermath to be as fragile as his son's diseased flesh. A boy king raised to embody the promise of a new Protestant age had fallen victim to forces neither flesh nor ambition could withstand. His fragile body, sealed in layers of lead and wood, became both a literal and symbolic tomb for the hopes of a dynasty. And so, in the hush that settled over Westminster Abbey, the echoes of Edward VI's reign faded into history, leaving behind only the memory of a brief, brilliant flame snuffed out too soon, and the unsettling realization that even royal blood could not preserve a life destined to dissolve.